Dave. Welcome to this installment of the Trans Support webinar series. Today's topic is on family relationships in times of COVID-19. I'm Jen Martinez, pronouns they, them. I am a doctoral intern and a full-time staff counselor, therapist at the counseling center.
Thanks, Jen. And I'm Renee Mitchell, pronouns she, hers. I am also a doctoral intern and an outgoing counselor at the counseling center.
And I'm Ethan Swift. I use pronouns he, him, and they, them. And I'm a doctoral intern and full-time counselor at the UMBC Counseling Center.
So this webinar series is one of 4 installments. So some of the other topics are finding community, family relationships, which is what we'll be talking about today, romantic relationships, social transition, and coming out.
I also want to highlight a name change mobilization coming up in fall 2020. That's with Free State Justice, and details are to be determined. But I will share that we're hoping to help walk trans folks through some name change legal processes and see, kind of get you set up for that.
And additionally, at the counseling center, we also tend to offer some kind of trans support space. So in the past, this has been an in-person group at the counseling center. This semester, due to COVID, we offered it virtually. And so there will be some type of offering of this kind of space in the fall, pending whatever UMBC decides in terms of reopening. But this is open to all UMB students who identify under the trans umbrella. And in the group meetings, it's less organized, less formal in terms of topics, but if it is in an online format, then we tend to kind of provide some information and have some follow-up discussion. And information about all of these different offerings and programs are available on our website and also on our MyUMBC page. So if you follow us there, you'll be able to stay up to date about what it is that we're offering, both in terms of trans support and then also just generally at the counseling center.
Before we get into today's topic, there's just a few points I want to highlight that we're really wanting to create a space for folks to have the opportunity to reflect on your own experiences. We'll also be discussing some of our own kind of responses and reactions and experiences as a way to help facilitate some reflection around this. And to also provide resources. So we'll be talking about different resources throughout, different strategies, different kind of more practical resources, and we'll have more at the end of these slides to provide. We do want to note that this is not intended to be a substitute for psychotherapy. And if you feel like you or someone you know would like some help around mental health concerns, and if you're a student, not a full-time student, but a student at UMBC, but if you want to receive services, you can contact our counseling center and leave a message to consult with one of our staff members. If you are suffering from any significant psychological distress and believe that you might put yourself or others at risk of harm, we do encourage you to contact 911 for emergency help. If you're on campus, to call campus police or go to the nearest emergency room. So, getting into today's topic, we'll be talking about family relationships. We're going to talk about some of the current stressors, particularly kind of the context right now around the pandemic and what those kind of stressors may look like or put on our family relationships. We'll talk about some coping strategies and then kind of discuss what are different strategies to engage in and considerations for managing these.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. So I do want to kind of jump into some of the material. Although it's been a little while since the pandemic started, many of us had to cope with that sudden disruption to our relationships. It was really sudden and forced and unexpected, obviously. And there's a lot of associated emotions that come with that: anxiety, grief, helplessness, anger. And I know a lot of us have kind of transitioned to a different groove, or kind of in a place where maybe we feel differently. But I want to highlight that grief, that I think all of us are still grieving the loss of control and the disruptions to our relationships.
Yeah, and there's a piece here too that even if it's been some time, that these emotions, if we weren't fully aware of them as we were experiencing them in the moment, they still might linger a little bit, right? And so to kind of acknowledge that what happened in March was really dramatic in some ways. It was sudden, it was forced upon us. And so to kind of be a few months out now, looking back, you might see how some of these emotional experiences kind of made themselves known to you, or kind of you maybe tried to kind of push them under the rug and just survive for a minute, and now they're starting to pop up. But that there's a lot of ways to react to what happened in March and the changes around our family and our relationships there.
Thanks for adding that, Renee. And then when we think about being like at home with family, if that's where we're at, we could potentially be in a potentially invalidating environment, especially when we're sharing space 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. This leaves us vulnerable to microaggressions and even open hostility, especially, this focus of this webinar series being on trans folks. Like, home is often not a safe place for us, or being with family is often difficult to navigate, whether it's safe or some variation of unsafe. It's definitely something to navigate. To add, this could be a loss of independence, a loss of personal space, a loss of boundaries, or a mix of these things. I definitely want to highlight, like, for many folks who come in, maybe transitioning at school or being out at school, now they come home to a place where maybe that's not as accessible, or even if it is, you don't feel as fluid without community. So I want to highlight the difficulties surrounding being in this potentially invalidating environment.
Yeah, I'll also add that, for folks who may have already been living at home, that part of this change means that you're also kind of adjusting to be in very close, frequent contact with family members or people you're living with, and I think that has its own challenges too, of kind of trying to figure out what those boundaries are, and adjusting to that type of shared space.
Yeah, what once might have been like a small portion of the pie in terms of your daily interactions, right? Like maybe you interacted with family, maybe you talked daily on the phone, maybe you didn't, right? Has now taken up most of the pie. And so you're dealing with whatever complexities of family relationships you had before are now taking up so much more room in everyone's life right now. And part of what we're hoping to talk about today is how do you manage that then, right? So if you find yourself in an invalidating environment where you're not receiving the type of support or safety, emotional safety or security that you were experiencing on campus or with friends or in other communities, now that you're home, what does it mean to have to kind of get through that, and how can you get through that? and really we're hoping to be able to share some tips around like how to take care of yourself in this environment and really how to survive it. And at this point, that is the language that seems most appropriate, that this isn't about like thriving in our relationships necessarily. Like nobody's thriving during COVID, right? This is a really unprecedented, challenging experience. And it's in a lot of ways, how do I get through this without sort of minimizing the kind of damage or negative impact that it might have. And so I want to start out by saying it's really normal to feel impacted by our environment. And so if you find yourself in a place where you are experiencing those microaggressions, like their family members aren't using your pronouns or are invalidating in some other way, that again, now that those interactions are taking up a bigger piece of the pie, it's sort of this onslaught coming at you 24/7. It's so normal to feel to take that in to some degree, right? To not be able to always maintain that emotional boundary that recognizes that, you know, your family members' transphobia is their own, right? And to not internalize that in some way. And at the same time, having that self-compassion toward yourself, like, yes, this is hard to be in this environment and it's hard to be in this context. And also to sort of watch out for how that environment might make its way into your own sort of psychological world, right? And take root in your mind in terms of negative self-talk or internalized transphobia that you might be feeling, being heightened because of just the information that you're getting from your environment constantly. And so trying to correct that if you can, right? So engaging in some self-care activities, trying to find space away from the invalidation and to try to make space for yourself where you take care of yourself and affirm yourself. And so we can, I'll pause at this point and see if Jen and Ethan have things to add, but we'll also invite you to reflect on what that might look like for you. And we'll talk about how to determine what feels good in terms of self-care activities in a moment, but I'll pause here.
Yeah, I think something that I would like to add is that for me, at least I've noticed that what self-care looks like and what those strategies are will change. And so there's some that work, you know, some days, and then it feels like at some point it becomes more avoidant, or it's not. It feels like it's taking more from me than it's replenishing my resources, and then having to evaluate, well, what other thing can I do then? And so I think part of it's also just kind of reflecting and checking in with yourself to see, you know, is there any adjustments that need to be made to be taking care of yourself?
Yeah, to add to that, like I think of my self-care activities as like a toolbox that I carry around. Even if I have to literally write down activities that I enjoy and find soothing and calming, and have to pick from one of those, and that's really helpful. And I think what you said, Jen, makes sense. Like some don't feel replenishing; they feel more like a chore. So that's when I kind of bring out my different kind of variety and go from there. And yeah, I think I just want to reiterate that piece of like, you could always write out, make a long list, and go from there.
I really appreciate that metaphor of a toolbox also, because I think it can really help explain the importance of self-care in this context. So if we think about like living in an invalidating environment, right, where you're being exposed to microaggressions and transphobia, that a lot of the work about maintaining your own wellness in that context is about putting up some boundaries and putting up, like, you can think about boundaries in this way as a bit of a wall, and it's the permeability or how much goes back and forth between the wall is up to you, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but it requires maintenance and it requires building. And the more kind of the more your environment is attacking that wall, the more you have to repair it and build it back up. And so if you're in a space where you're being met with invalidating interactions 24/7, it's going to take more work to keep that wall built. And so the more tools you have at your disposal to do that, the better. And so I'll invite you, if you're watching this, to just take a minute and think about what are some things that you do find soothing and calming for yourself. It's so personal and so individual that even if we were to share what works for the three of us, you might find none of them applicable to you. But thinking about what really brings you peace and what really brings you calm, and if you can get a list of those things going, that can be helpful. It's also and thinking about things that are soothing and calming, something that I think can be a helpful framework is thinking about your different sensations. So what it is that appeals to your visual sense, right? What is pleasing on your eyeballs? What feels nice to you? What smells nice? What tastes nice, right? These are ways to think about things that might be soothing and calming. And then where in your environment, like physically, and also like where in your day-to-day, like time-wise, can you find space to engage in these activities? So that's what I would encourage you to think about in terms of implementing that self-care and that self-compassion while you're at home. And then once a second kind of way of coping in an invalidating environment, apart from just focusing inward and focusing on yourself, is also thinking about what is it that you want that relationship to look like with the folks in your environment. So self-care, Jen, Ethan, and I were talking about this just this morning. Self-care is an interaction between you and your environment. And you can focus on yourself as a way to try to bolster some of that self-care and some of that healing. But to a degree, part of what you're experiencing is related to the environment that you're in. And how much you try to change or address your home environment is really such a personal choice. And it really depends on the so many different factors related to what's going on at home, how receptive folks are, and also your own capacity. So what feels safe to you, emotionally safe to you, how strong is your toolbox, how much have you built it up, and the combination of those things. And so in determining sort of how you want to engage in your environment, I would really encourage you to reflect on what level of openness and vulnerability feels safe in these relationships. So is it the case that you find that if you are open and genuine and authentic, that you have someone on the other side who is receptive and supportive? Maybe they don't get it on their own, but when you share, you find that their mind is expanded and they're open. That's a different situation than being open and being vulnerable and having that person use that information against you or continue to microaggress against you after you've opened yourself up, right? And in the first case, maybe it makes sense to and maybe you find it rewarding to engage in open conversations with that person around gender identity or around your experiences. Whereas in the latter case, it really feels like just more harm is coming from those conversations. And and then there's so many options in between, right? Those are sort of two extremes. And so then thinking about, okay, how much energy and bandwidth do I have to navigate this? So am I gonna, if this conversation tends to go one way, how am I gonna feel? And if it's starting to move in a different direction, how am I gonna feel? And kind of responding accordingly. So being able to be upfront and saying something like that hurt my feelings and explaining why, versus temporarily we're going to agree to disagree and I'm going to back away, or I'm going to avoid this topic for now because that feels safest. And again, your range of response can match the range of kind of receptivity or responsiveness you're getting back from the other person. And then that's all within your home environment. So if you're trying to manage all that, it's so complicated and it takes so much energy and it can be so draining. And so then it becomes important to find spaces where you don't have to worry about those things, right? So supportive spaces, affirming spaces, spaces where people just get it, where you don't have to explain yourself and you don't have to navigate those types of boundaries as much. And we'll talk about some resources for finding those too in a moment. But I'll pause now and see if other folks want to jump in.
Yeah, I think that agree to disagree piece is an interesting but important one. I think about like times when I did spend more time with my family early in my transition. And it's basically you have to choose, like, do I feel like I have the bandwidth to close myself off, or do I have the bandwidth to assert myself, or do I have the bandwidth to avoid this? And all can be painful in different ways, but also some can be like kind of like minimizing harm to myself. So like at times, like sometimes I just wouldn't be out or outgoing about my identity or even presentation, which is really painful, but it helped me navigate difficult family situations. That's kind of where I'm at with that one.
Yeah, I really appreciate you sharing that too. And this, I think that it's such an important component to acknowledge that all of this takes so much effort and energy and emotional output to be managing and navigating. And again, that's where that self-care piece, that compassion, self-compassion piece, and finding supportive and affirming spaces really comes in to again fill that toolbox, bolster that toolbox, so that you're able to take care of yourself and better manage and navigate your own world when you're in this really kind of unique and complicated situation.
So we did want to provide some resources for you, um, different ways that for you as an individual to get support, um, around connecting with community, connecting to any sort of mental health support. So the Trevor Project's line is on there. You can also text or chat online if you don't feel comfortable calling. We also have resources for family members, um, particularly, kind of thinking about it can feel like a lot of work to be the one providing education to folks who have a lot of questions, and I think if possible that there are a number of different resources available to help family members kind of understand language better, be able to understand the experience better, um, and so we wanted to provide those resources to you. One thing to note is that the HRC Trans Children Youth resource here, even though it's targeted towards children and youth, it does provide a lot of kind of the basic information, terminology, and definitions in ways that are really accessible. So, if we included this on here because it seems like a resource that could also be helpful for adults to be able to understand all of these different things in in a really accessible way.
We realize that you're not able to access the links through this video, but what we will do is we'll post them in the same place that this video is located. So you should be able to access the links to those resources, the same place you found this webinar.
Great point. And we also wanted to provide a number of different resources via Facebook. I know that sometimes Facebook can be a problematic space to be in. And we do want to highlight that there are a number of groups on Facebook that do provide a lot of support and resources. So on the left-hand side, these are specific to the Baltimore area. And on the right, this is more without the assumption that people are still in state or in even in the city. These are different resources on Facebook all over the world and all over the country.
Awesome. Thanks, Jen. I think that's our last slide. So I just want to say thanks for everyone who's watching, and definitely more to follow. So enjoy the rest of your day for folks watching. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Jen and Ethan.